Hello everyone and welcome to Clickheads. I'm Eddie and today we're going to be talking about a gaming industry giant, a game that legitimately changed the gaming landscape around it and put in place gameplay mechanics that we still regard as modern even today. It is hard to believe that it's 15 years old at this point. I am of course talking about Resident Evil 4, a bona fide classic that reinvented a genre while also defining one. Why are we talking about this game now? Well, for a few reasons. Firstly, it was the 15-year anniversary of its release last week, something that is sure to make many people feel old AF. There's also recently been a trailer dropped for the Resident Evil 3 remake, which sees its release in March this year. A quick note about that, the remake of Resident Evil 2 that came out last year was for a long time fan fiction, something that would never actually occur, a myth, a dream, and yet it did come out, and further yet, it was absolutely amazing. A lot of that game's DNA was rooted in the third-person action horror that Resident Evil 4 defined and revolutionized. Things like being able to aim your weapons more accurately at specific parts of your enemies for the first time ever for extra damage or tactical stuns, upgradable equipment and secrets to hunt for, even down to simple things like how your character navigates the 3D space, translating the Resident Evil puzzle-solving elements into 3D space, melee combat and more. All the modern titles owe a huge debt to Resi 4, and the core gameplay was so good it has only been tweaked in minor ways since that landmark title's first release on the GameCube in 2005. Perhaps more astoundingly, as a huge Resident Evil fan myself, you might be shocked to learn that Resi 4 is the one game in the core series that I haven't ever played. Well, partly to cover my own shame, and partly for this video, I have since corrected this, and what we're going to be doing today is looking back at the design of 4 to analyse what makes it so special and how its legacy is still being felt today. Most of you watching will have already played it anyway, so I'm not going to waste time covering things that a normal review might for a new title. Instead, I want to zero in on the things that strike me the most profoundly, the parts of the game that really make me feel, oh wow, yeah, this really is as good as everyone says, the ways it deserves its reputation. Then I'll cover what I think are legitimate criticisms that one could make, albeit with the context that I don't know if I've mentioned this, but this game is 15 years old. With all that laborious groundwork done, let's begin. Start well, finish strong. It's convenient for me to talk about the beginning of a game at the beginning of a review, but there's just something so special about how Resident Evil games kick off their play experience. It's a bit of a trope by now that the games start off chaotic, throwing the player in immediately with as little preamble as possible, or at least it is from this game onwards. You could make the argument that this precedent was first seen in Resident Evil 2 and 3, with both those games also starting with a bang. Resident Evil 2 begins with a massive gas tanker crash and a breakneck run to the relative safety of the police station, and 3 literally begins with Jill dodging an explosion to be immediately surrounded by zombies in the same city. In 4, we get a great little intro after the opening story recap of Leon in a car with 2 Spanish complete jobs worth cops. Now I have a particular favourite moment in this little sequence. While they're driving, the dialogue is suitably terrible but also wonderful.
You are a long way from home, cowboy. You have my sympathies.
Guess that's a local's way of breaking the ice.
And for whatever reason, one of the cops stops for a piss. I can't believe what a masterstroke this is because A, it immediately gives a sense of realism to the proceedings. I mean, imagine yourself working at Capcom and your director says, today you'll be animating the roadside slash break. Yeah, okay, totally normal for a AAA game, exclusive to the Nintendo GameCube no less on release. But B, it also allows the game to visually establish that the characters are being watched with some well thought out camera angles. Now it's another Resident Evil trope that any peripheral characters the player encounters, like these 2 cops, are sure to die, like red shirts from Star Trek. The only question is how. Eventually, you have to get out of the car and go to a house that borders the entrance to the first game area. In this house is your first zombie, or as it turns out, it's not a zombie, but a person under the influence of a parasite that becomes the game's central theme. We're not dealing with T or G viruses here, this is something else. At this point, I want to talk about why this change meant so much at the time. Killing a zombie has almost no guilt associated with it. The person who that zombie was is gone, and now they're just a threat, a bag of meat with teeth to be avoided or put down. Las Plagas is different. The person infected is still technically alive, they might be under the influence of the main villain, Sadler, and initially at least thought to be beyond cure, but they are still a person who given any opportunity will kill you. So player, make your choice. Now it's not much of a choice, admittedly. Play the game, kill the infected in your way to progress, or don't and turn it off. Hardly a viable moral quandary, but I couldn't shake the fact that in Resident Evil 4, when I used my new ability to aim for people's heads, it wasn't a zombie's head. Now after this first encounter, a whole bunch of stuff happens. More villagers arrive, our two red shirts get their car rammed into a ravine, and the game begins in earnest. When we get to the village, the game sets out its stall. Here is a large area with many enemies, too many to outright kill, and you're going to need to survive, run away, and figure out what you need to do, and hopefully do that before you get trapped and killed. Oh yeah, red shirt number 1 is dead, impaled at the center of the village. Nice! This is the essential gameplay loop of Resident Evil 4, and it's so wonderful and divergent from the series past that I'm going to have to talk about it in more detail. Same spirit, in a different body. When this game first came out, a lot of the praise centered around how it kept the same feeling of a Resident Evil, but completely broke away from the pre-rendered backgrounds, slow controls, and dubious pacing of the originals. It is survival horror, but whereas the combat in the older games was awkward and underdeveloped, in this game, it's a key part of the gameplay experience. When Resident Evil games had fixed camera angles, things like aiming and evasion were crude, almost by necessity. That was part of what made them scary. You couldn't look around corners and know what's coming next. Every change in camera angle had a potential nasty surprise waiting for you, and typically you didn't have the supplies to just fight everything hostile anyway. What those circumstances are very good at is creating tension, but what it can also be is frustrating. The action of combat was often not the fun of those games, but something to be managed. Resident Evil 4 says, nah fam, combat is going to be amazing. The gameplay of shooting and fighting is going to be a rewarding experience, and most of the time, ammo, although still rare enough to warrant management, it's not so rare that you can't enjoy a fight. For instance, when you kill enemies, they will often drop ammo, and there are crates everywhere that can contain health items or more ammo, occasionally snakes, but more on that later. There are core elements to Resident Evil games that help define its identity, and puzzle solving is one of them. But what Capcom did with 4 is not only include traditional puzzles to solve, but by changing the combat and the arenas it occurs in so drastically, they turned each room into a combat puzzle of its own. Quite often you will enter an area, not know its layout or enemy placement, and have to problem solve on the fly with the help of a shotgun. That was so genuinely groundbreaking for this series, and those lessons are still being felt today. The remake of Resident Evil 2 was converted into this third-person perspective specifically because it suits this style of game so well. You can play a version of it 15 years later and it's still rewarding. Now if I had to guess, this evolution is thanks to other games like Metal Gear Solid, which were very popular in and around the same time period. In fact, there are a number of times where I felt this influence quite sharply. These games are kind of similar in key ways. Each area can be solved in new and emergent ways. You're equipped for violence, but taught through experience that direct confrontation isn't always your best approach, and of course, high camp dialogue with melodramatic narrative. But being honest, Resident Evil 4 kinda does it better. Another thing it does better is RPG-like progressional play, which is what we're going to talk about next. Hello, stranger! So in Resi games you could upgrade weapons as early as Resident Evil 2, with the Magnum and shotgun parts being memorable, even if the Magnum fire rate was made worse if you did that. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. This was continued in Resident Evil 3 if you chose to fight the Nemesis Tyrant as often as possible and get rewarded every other fight with gun parts. This was massively expanded on in Resi 4 with the inclusion of a merchant system, which includes everyone's favourite character, this guy.
Over here, stranger.
So what's so great about this is that as you go through the game, you can upgrade all your weapons, buy new ones, upgrade them, sell old ones to pay for it, buy more inventory space, buy treasure maps, rocket launchers, and health items. What is even better is there is no way in one playthrough that you can fully upgrade everything. The game actively encourages you to replay once you've finished with New Game Plus. When you do that, you keep everything you've earned, so you will end up having the best Magnum in the game, or a handgun with vastly increased base power. All of the weapons in the game also have secret upgrades only available when you fully upgraded every stat. So in reality, you have so many reasons to keep playing. This, it won't surprise you to learn, is in the newest games, although minus an actual merchant. Resi fans didn't know they needed this before Resident Evil 4. Now RPG-like elements are a complete necessity to the core gameplay. The timing and the placement of where the merchant appears is also expertly understood by the developers. Very often, when you see those blue flames, you know shit's about to go down. It really is a shame, actually, that in the following game, Resident Evil 5, there is no merchant. You just upgrade and buy stuff before the next level. It works just as well in some ways, I'd argue, but I know I'm not alone in wanting more of this guy. Quite why he has a working-class British accent in rural Spain is anybody's guess, though. Back in my day. Next, I want to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that's difficulty and game length. Resident Evil 4 is not an easy game by my estimation, even on normal difficulty on first playthrough. There are parts of the game that will really kick your ass. It is way harder than Resident Evil 5, which is basically a very similar experience, except co-op that leans even more action-based. Now, because I sacrilegiously played 5 before 4, there were a lot of enemy types that didn't hit me with a "oh my god, what the fuck is that" moment, including the infamous Chainsaw Ganado. Let me try and describe to you how shocking this enemy was when the game first came out. It was so famous, I knew about it even without playing the game. The chainsaw decapitation death animation was so visceral, it really made people sit up and take notice. Did I mention this was a Nintendo exclusive on release? Before, when you died in Resi games, it was a bit tame. Only the death of the gun store owner or the police chief / journalist in the original Resident Evil 2 can compare. You could get decapitated in the first game by hunters, but it was nowhere near this. On my playthrough, I didn't actually die to any of these chainsaw Ganados. The first one, I heroically hit up this tower and took flame damage instead, and the second I just hit with flash grenades and some 12 gauge justice. I also chose the path later on to fight another El Gigante instead of the sisters, but remember how I said earlier that this game starts out so strong? Well, that includes the Chainsaw Ganado. There is one in virtually the very first real room of the game. Capcom did not pull any punches with this game, and that philosophy continues throughout. For the first 2 acts, I wouldn't call the difficulty pedestrian, as everything hurts and health items aren't that frequent, but if you've played Resident Evil, you can figure out when to run and when to fight. Act 3 is where the game says, you know what, fuck you, you're gonna die. I would say the first time this really happens is this room. I entered, couldn't believe the number of enemies and their placement, and just hoped that running through would be enough. Cliff notes, it wasn't. What followed was various attempts, eventually leading to me heroically hiding in a room at the back with the pad puzzle in it and killing everything that entered the room or dropped through the hole in the ceiling. Eventually I killed everybody and their nan, got ballistics to turn the crank, and then it started all over again. I eventually completed the room, nearly dying many times only to escape out the other side. Now, a lot of you will know that the game gets way harder than this room, but I was taken aback by how quickly the game went from 0 to 100, especially when you consider this comes directly after the prison room where you fight the blind Wolverine enemy type for the first time. This is one of the ways in which the game dates itself. When I say this, that's not as a negative. I wish modern games were more difficult. Resident Evil 5 only has a few areas that rival this in its entirety, and if there's one legitimate criticism of Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's that it's far too easy and far too short. Resident Evil 4 is an old game in the best sense. It doesn't coddle, it doesn't handhold, it throws crazy shit at you and trusts you to figure it out. It's also long, like really long. Yes, the speedrun has gotten down to way under 2 hours, but for the uninitiated like I was, it's a deeply satisfying playthrough that requires many play sessions, and that's not including Mercenaries, New Game Plus, or Ada's expansion. Perhaps it's a victim of its own success. Resident Evil 5 and 6 are both long, but by 6, which everyone universally pans with good reason, the core Resident Evil experience had been largely diluted by Capcom chasing Call of Duty audiences. Only with Resident Evil 7 did they really rediscover how these games are supposed to feel, both in terms of their atmosphere and their gameplay. They got it right with 4 and only lost ground from there. This is why it is rightly regarded as a classic. Many of you won't have played the PS1 Resident Evil original, but let me tell you, that game was hard. So hard, they had to release a director's cut with more ammo and support items, as so few players actually completed the original. That's how games used to be. As such, Resident Evil 4 does feel like a product of a different era. Classics through a modern lens. One of the problems of looking at old art through modern eyes is that we live in such a different culture now than we did even just 15 years ago. Certain aspects of older work will inevitably clash with our modern sensibilities. Resident Evil 4 is not exempt from this. It is undeniably a masterwork, but it does contain stuff that even I, someone who is not an SJW by any means, winces at. Earlier I referred to a Resident Evil trope regarding narrative. Resi games are the height of camp, with many elements of their story and dialogue being utterly ridiculous. This is largely a stylistic choice, a knowing, tongue-in-cheek relationship between the storyteller and the audience. What being camp allows you to do is be outrageous, without judgment, because the audience is also in on the joke. This gets a bit muddier when one culture is expressing its representation of another. It is subject to another perspective that can distort and shift what is permissible. I don't buy into cultural appropriation as a concept. In fact, most of the great art from human history occurs when strict cultural lines blur and hybrid art is produced, generating something genuinely new, like Jimi Hendrix or Eminem. Cultural exchange in art furthers the pursuit of our collective effort to understand each other better, find what is common between us, and stave off the inevitable facts of isolation and eventual death. Wow, that got deep for a moment and pretentious, but I do feel that way. This cultural exchange makes us better and feel less alone, connects us in ways that we weren't before, and genuinely makes the world a better place, But what does this have to do with Resident Evil 4? Well, Resident Evil games are a Japanese cultural product, but they're almost universally set in the West. They are Japan's expression of Western horror, and as such, they are subject to some elements that feel a bit odd or out of place. I would argue the use of high camp and melodrama already is odd for Western audiences, because outside of musical theatre, the West has erred towards realism whenever possible in general. One thing that I did notice playing this game in 2020 is that the gender representations in Resident Evil 4 can be what I would consider insensitive by modern Western values. Just like the issue of race in Resident Evil 5, these topics are handled a bit clumsily. Now, before I lose a lot of you because I sound way too woke, I will say it's not all the representations of women in this game that make me go, excuse me? Ada, for example, is given great treatment. She's even more badass in this game than she was in Resident Evil 2. It's the treatment of Ashley that made me go, wait a minute. There's one scene in particular that I can't believe actually happens. When Luis meets Ashley for the first time, right before one of the best moments in the game where you fight off hordes of Ganados in a tiny house, Luis basically says, I didn't know she would have such big tits.
Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics too.
Now, this is funny. There's even a Steam achievement for rescuing Ashley for the first time called Secure the Ballistics, which is a knowing nod to this moment. But consider how, rightly or wrongly, you would never be able to do that now. Or perhaps more accurately, you would never be allowed to do that in the West today. Japan can get away with anything. What's perhaps a little bit weirder to me is that one, Ashley's age is murky, or I should say the characterization of her age is murky. The game is set in 2004 and Ashley is supposedly born in 1984, so that would make her 20 years old in-game. However, she's portrayed as very young acting, even if she's actually older. I can't be the only one who feels that how she's portrayed has heavy pedo bear subtext alarms going off. Maybe that's not fair, I'm just being honest. Characters often talk about her in her presence, not to her. In fact, Lewis and Leon do this in the same ballistics scene. She is objectified, that is just a fact, either as a sex symbol, ew, or as a damsel archetype. To counter that, there is a section of the game where you control just Ashley herself, so she does have agency in some ways. But overall, I think you have to rescue her like 5 times or something throughout the game. It does get a bit silly. Now, judging the game harshly for these elements is a bit uncharitable for a few reasons. One, having to rescue someone in principle isn't an outrageous concept. It does happen in real life and can make for a gripping narrative. There's a reason the damsel in distress archetype exists, whether the damsel be female or male, because it can be compelling. And two, having a character that has their agency removed from them by force isn't wrong inherently either, because that does happen too. I'm just leveling with you guys. I'm not a person who buys into wokeness, but the treatment of Ashley did make me laugh out loud a few times. At least we can all agree that some of the escort parts of the game aren't as fun as all the others from a gameplay perspective. Raise a hand if you quote unquote accidentally killed Ashley when she's being carried away by an enemy because she's really annoying. Yeah, that's what I thought. In fact, these are my only 2 criticisms of the game in all seriousness. It's a bit clumsy at times in regards to Ashley, how she's characterized and how she works in game, and even Ingrid, who gets this totally unnecessary line of dialogue from Leon in their very first call.
Support on this mission.
Loud and clear. Somehow I thought you'd be a little older.
Maybe these things stick out to me more because the rest of the game is so good. The contrast between the sublime and the ridiculous is drawn into sharper relief. A legacy ignored and then rediscovered. To end, I just want to reconnect with why I'm looking back at this game now. This game turned 15 years old very recently, yet when you play it, in all the ways that really matter, it feels utterly modern. The games we're enjoying now, and are going to be enjoying soon, owe a huge debt to Resident Evil 4, and without it, we would likely never be playing them in the first place. It's telling that only when Capcom returned closer to the blueprint that this game set out than, say, Resident Evil 5 and 6 did, the series began to become really popular again, both commercially and critically. Even though 7 is a first-person game, it too owes this game a lot. The reach of 4's legacy is vast, and it truly does deserve the moniker classic. So when you pick up Resident Evil 3 Remake, and it blows you away with its pitch-perfect pacing, story, and mechanics, pull one out for this game. It does deserve it. I still can't believe I never played it until now. And that's about it for today. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you like the content on this channel, please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you get notified when we upload. Until next time.